Our gospel reading on this Baptism of the Lord Sunday comes to us from the Gospel according to Mark, chapter 1, verses 9 through 11. Let me invite you to listen for God's word to us today. In those days, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. And just as he was coming up out of the water, he saw the heavens torn apart, and the Spirit descending like a dove on him. And a voice came from heaven, "You are my Son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased." The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Have you ever made a big deal over a small thing? Do you know what I mean? Making a big deal over a small thing. I recall one of my previous installation services as a pastor when I was beginning my pastorate in Indiana many years ago. The preacher at that service was a friend and colleague from Texas. We knew each other well, having worked for almost 6 years together in Texas, and I was very glad to have him preach at my installation in my next call. Now, at a service of installation, you want everything to be just right, perfect, if you will. So, of course, there was a typo in the bulletin. Not a big deal, but it listed the text on which my colleague was going to preach, 1 Corinthians 13. It listed that text as the Old Testament reading for the day. Well, I was hoping he would not see the mistake, hoping he wouldn't notice. When it came time for the sermon, my colleague began by thanking the congregation, and then he explained to them how, when I worked at his church, I always taught the confirmation class, and I always had the class memorize the books of the Bible. Then he looked at me, sitting in the front pew, and he said, "Ben, 1 Corinthians is in the New Testament." And it was funny, and everybody laughed, and it was a good way to break the ice. It can be amusing sometimes to make a big deal over a small thing. And sometimes it's a mistake to do it. Sometimes we wish we had not done it. Have you ever gotten angry at somebody before? And what you got mad about was about something really small, really trivial. And after you had settled down and things had cooled down, you went back and you thought about it and you thought, why did I get so upset over something so small? Making a big deal over a small thing. I'd like to do that this morning. Not get mad. I'd like to make a big deal over a small thing, if you don't mind. It's a small detail in our text. Our text from Mark today describes the baptism of Jesus. And just as he was coming up out of the water, he saw the heavens torn apart and the Spirit descending like a dove on him. This is very similar to the ways that Matthew and Luke describe this event, but there is a difference. Matthew and Luke say that the heavens were opened, the heaven was opened, almost as if heaven has doors, and God gently opened the doors, and the Spirit calmly came down on Jesus. It's not the way Mark describes the event. Mark says that Jesus saw the heavens torn apart. Why did Mark write torn apart? Is this a minor difference, a small thing, or is it a big thing? To say that the heavens were torn apart is to suggest ripping, if you will. Is that a word that we think of when we talk about baptism? No. When we baptize someone here at Westminster, the child's parents, or the confirmand or adult being baptized, they receive a baptismal certificate. Most churches do this. Can you imagine that person or those parents going home with that baptismal certificate and just saying, who cares, and ripping it, tearing it apart? No, of course not. When I think of baptism, I think of baptismal gowns passed down through the generations, very gently handled through the years, not tearing the gown, not ripping the gown. So why does Mark use the words torn apart? Why does he use this startling image? Maybe I'm just making too big a deal over a small thing this morning. Do you think I'm making too big a deal over a small thing? Before you answer that, let's do a little more exploring. Torn apart. Those words don't just suggest ripping, they suggest power. The power of God at work in Jesus' baptism. When you think of the power of God at work in your life, what do you think of? How would you describe God's power? A colleague tells the story of another pastor who once went to visit one of his parishioners in the hospital. This woman was suffering from a terminal disease, and the pastor went to visit her, knowing that at the end of the visit he would pray one of those prayers that acknowledges the desperation of the situation, a prayer that is already settled about what the outcome will be, a prayer that asks for God's blessing and God's peace, but does not ask God for physical healing that will not come. Now, I've prayed that kind of prayer. All ministers know the importance of that kind of prayer. This pastor, he went there prepared to pray that kind of prayer, but the woman, when he saw her, the woman prevailed upon him to beg God for healing for her. Well, what do? Against his better judgment, he prayed the prayer that the woman wanted him to pray. He prayed fervently for her healing, even while he understood that the only reason he was praying it was that this parishioner had asked him to do it. When the prayer was over, he left, and a few days later, he was back for another visit. Only this time, the woman was sitting up in bed. The tubes had been removed, the curtains were open. She said to him, "You won't believe what's happened." She said, "The doctors noticed some changes the other day and called for more x-rays, and they have told me that they can no longer see any sign of a tumor. I'm going home tomorrow." That pastor who prayed the prayer he did not want to pray, you know what he said he did in the parking lot? "I looked up at the skies," he said, "and I shook my fist at God and said, 'Don't you ever do that to me again.'" Now, was that the power of God, breaking into that woman's life to save her, tearing through a terminal diagnosis to give her new life? I don't know. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. I have no idea. What I do know is that it's not the only way in which Mark's gospel teaches us to think about God's power. Torn apart. Let's go back to that word. The Greek verb that's used here in the text is schizo. It's where we get the word for schizophrenic. Do you know where else this verb is used in Mark's gospel? At the very end, chapter 15. Then Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Torn in two. Same word used here. Think about this. Heaven's torn when Jesus is baptized. Curtain of the temple torn when Jesus died. I wonder if Mark is linking these two events to help us understand what God's power is all about. You see, the Gospel of Mark does not say that God's power only shows up in big and noticeable events, like Jesus stilling the storm or Jesus healing blind Bartimaeus. Now, according to Mark, it is not only in the miracles of Jesus, but in the suffering of Jesus that God's power becomes fully known. And we get a preview of that, I think, in Jesus' baptism. Just look at what God says to Jesus in his baptism. Do you remember the words? God says, "You are my Son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased." It's a powerful statement. The first part of those words, "You are my Son, the beloved," it comes from Psalm 2, words used at the coronation of a king, words used for God to claim that person as God's own. The power of God claimed Jesus at his baptism. And the second part, "With you I am well pleased," it comes from Isaiah 42, which is one of the suffering servant passages in Isaiah. In other words, at his baptism, Jesus is not only claimed, he is called. Called not to a life of leisure and smooth sailing, but called to be God's suffering servant. All that is packed into Jesus' baptism. And may I put it like this? It's also part of your baptism, and it's also part of my baptism. Like Jesus, we are both claimed and called, claimed by God's love and called to carry that love, not just to the smooth places of our society where things gently open for us, but called to go to the difficult places. Our baptism means that we're called to work for peace and justice in God's world, and to do so in non-violent ways, even when working for that justice and that peace is difficult. A few years ago, the Christian Century wrote about a Presbyterian pastor named Ralph Homburger. Back in 2014, Homburger received the Distinguished Alumni Award from Princeton Seminary, which published his story. Homburger grew up first in Germany and later in the Netherlands. His father was Jewish, his mother a Gentile who did not practice religion. As a young man, Ralph Homburger had a hunger for God. As war descended upon the Netherlands, he grew increasingly angry over the heinous campaign against the Jewish people and worked in the Dutch underground movement, helping many threatened people escape to places of safety. After the war, he came to the United States a broken man, with deep grief and anger swirling around inside of him, hatred for those who sought to exterminate the Jewish people. What did he do with this anger and hatred and grief? First, he joined a lay ministry of young people who served as agents of reconciliation, going to war-torn parts of Europe to join in physically rebuilding the country. Then he went to seminary. Then he served a couple churches in the United States. And then he decided that God was calling him to serve churches behind the Iron Curtain. So the Reverend Ralph Homburger spent the rest of his ministry in danger of getting thrown in jail, all because he wanted to spread God's love and work for justice in a communist-controlled land. Why not stay in the United States? Why not practice his ministry in a safe place? Do you think that perhaps Ralph Homburger understood the call and the claim of his baptism? I do. I believe he understood something about the power of God, something I trust you understand as well. When our baptisms ask us to carry a burden, to carry a cross, to suffer on behalf of someone else. It is not a call that separates us from God. It is a call that draws us closer to God. As Isaiah puts it in our Old Testament text for today, do not fear, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name, you are mine. When you pass through the waters, they shall not overwhelm you. When you walk through fire, the flame shall not consume you. Notice it does not say that we do not get to avoid going through the waters. We do not get to avoid walking through the fire, so to speak. But God will be with us every step of the way when we do. Working for peace in non-violent ways, working for justice in non-violent ways. It doesn't have to mean traveling to a foreign country. We can do it right here at home. One of my colleagues tells about a time early in his ministry when he found himself embroiled in a rather nasty theological fight at the denominational level, a church fight, if you will. As is often the case in such disputes, he writes, the opposing groups were not just debating parties. They were feared enemies, each side persuaded that the other sought to undermine the faithfulness of the church. During one of the most acrimonious seasons of this struggle, my colleague learned that his 4-week-old daughter would need to be hospitalized for surgery. It was, he says, a dark and frightening time for a new parent like himself. Well, the day before the surgery, my colleague received a telephone call from one of the leaders of the other group in this theological dispute. I groaned to myself, he says, "Not now, I beg you, not now." The voice on the other end of the line then spoke unexpected words. "I heard about your daughter," this adversary said to my colleague. "I want you to know that she and you are in my prayers." My colleague goes on to say that there was something about his voice, the tenor of his voice, that let him know this was not just the expression of pious sentiment. Something about the character of Christian love had found expression, even in the midst of that dispute, through that voice in that phone call. Now, what prompted that person to make that phone call? I believe it was his baptism. I believe it was the power of God at work in that person's life. Of course, the same is true for you and for me, right? In our baptisms, we are claimed and called by God. We too are given the job of going to the difficult places in our world, whether it's across an ocean or across a zip code or across the street or just crossing whatever barrier might be in our own heart right now. We are called to go to someone else, to share God's peace and justice and love. If we do it, God's power will be at work in our lives in ways that we can never dream. Now, I asked you a question toward the beginning of this sermon, and you may have forgotten it. Did I just make a big deal over a small thing? Or is the call and claim that God places on us in our baptism, is it perhaps the most important thing? Amen.